viewers, many thank you for joining us. You're watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is Future Africa Spotlight. Today we're going to talk about the Ethiopian national dialogue in the making. Here in the studio, I'm joined by Dr. Antanas Agaye. Doctor, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we'll be discussing about the Ethiopian national dialogue and the reconciliation in the making. First, what does it mean by reconciliation as a concept?
Yeah, I think a very good definition, very popular definition is, it is a meeting ground where trust and mercy have met and where justice and peace have kissed. So these four words are very much important in this definition. Reconciliation, to reconcile, involves building trust and based on truth. And at the same time, it is a process of forgetting and forgiving, which involves mercy. And at the same time, it should serve justice to the victims and should maintain or secure peace. So these 4 points are very much important in the process of reconciliation. Reconciliation is a process and at the same time an end. It is a process in a sense that requires the engagement of a number of parties which involve at the center the victims. And the process requires giving to give and to take. So reconciliation is a very complex concept, a very complex process because it demands a lot of determination on the part of the people involved. And the first thing is who are to reconcile. So we must be clear about who is to reconcile and who is to facilitate the process, because there must be an element of independent, being independent and try to deny self-denial in a sense that you try to be neutral to every of the group or the opponent. So there must be a facilitator, which we think is denying, position to the left or to the right. And the whole process requires, answering some questions, like in a sense that it has to secure irreversible, when people or group are to reconcile, and the whole process has to secure, the point where there would not be any conflict anymore. So there must be, an answer to that kind of phase. There must be an answer to that kind of phase. And the other thing is, who is to reconcile and at what level? Is the conflict at the group level? Is the conflict at the national level, at the international level? And who are the direct and the indirect, key players in the whole process of the conflict? So there are a number of examples that we can give, but we can talk about this later. But in all the process, the world has learned a lot from the whole process of reconciliation, and it is an attempt to break the circle of hate and the circle of hostility between or among groups.
Appreciate it. Okay, let me bring it to the case of Ethiopia, right? The government is processing to hold a national dialogue in the near future, right? I mean, how do you see this ambitious plan to hold this national dialogue?
I think this is a very important question to ask, especially at this phase of, or at this stage of the process, it's national dialogue. And when we think of this, and when we want to talk about this one, first I think we need to trace back to the other commission, what we call Salamna Ye'irq Afalalagi Commission, or Commission for Peace and Reconciliation. And that was...
Yeah, it was formed in 2019.
Exactly.
And it was headed by Cardinal Brahana Jesus and that of Yetnebesh Negusa,
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
exactly.
But it was not successful.
Yes.
To do so.
Yeah, we don't see them and we don't hear from them for long. You see, the point is And we need to be clear about the difference between these two. So the commission established in 2019, and we need to know what were the successes and what were, the problems associated with the practice of that commission. Because we need to take some lesson. And I think the establishment of that reconciliation was interesting. It was timely, and it was very early, which is interesting. But I think that has failed in one way or the other because we are in a serious crisis situation. The attempt was to prevent conflict and war. So by default, I think I can say that is simply a failure. What I think the government might have done some assessment on that, perhaps not communicated to the public. But what was wrong with them? And what's the difference between these two? And the first one, I think, when you read the proclamation, it's entirely more of on, human rights abuses. And that was actually before the war, and there were different displacements, human rights abuses prior to the change or the reform. And they were supposed to deal with that, I guess. But it's all about reconciliation and building truth and trust, and for the sake of justice and peace. But we don't exactly know the whole process and what happened to them. And 40 of them, they were government appointees, and they were not active in the communities and, the whole process of negotiation and trying to solve, different problems. But I think it is a good lesson, or the government has to take lesson from the previous commission to craft this one. And the focus of this one is entirely all about, building a common ground, and an attempt to build trust and to dialogue about, the unresolved political frictions and narratives that we have in this country. I really appreciate the establishment of this institution or this commission. Because so far, we've been treating the symptom, not the particular disease. In this country, during, the changes that we have experienced so far, I can give you 2 episodes. The first one is when the Haile Selassie regime was, down, and when the Derg took power. So that was the first breaking and making of Ethiopia. So the previous narratives of the country, they were broken, and then the Derg tried to, build a new path to the socialist Ethiopia. And the same was repeated during the downfall of the Derg, and that's the second episode. It's all about breaking and making of this country. So Ethiopia became ethnic nationalist country. So in the whole process, the Ethiopian history and the Ethiopian situation is all about the making and the breaking. So there is no continuity in nation-building process. So, and at the same time, if you look at the political frictions that we have, or the narratives in this country, is all about Ethiopia as a nation, and Ethiopia as, nations and nationalities, oppressed and like that. And the third is having, arguing that Ethiopia, we have, colonial relationship. We have a colonial relationship, kind of. So there are 3 unresolved political ideologies in this country. So it is quite important if we have a dialogue, a national dialogue, as a process, and which should take time and should be very inclusive, involving, people from different. So, we should not confuse 2 things. I think these days when you listen to people talking about the National Dialogue Commission, people talk about the reconciliation only. I don't think that's about a reconciliation between the, the rebel and the leader of the country. For me, as far as my understanding is concerned, and reading the document, it's all about involving the public, an attempt to go beyond the elites, to involve inclusively all people, all groups, to engage themselves in talking about what is our problem and how can we forge this country and how can we trace look at the back and try to go forward politically, socially, and in any dimension of the country.
But it's very difficult for the government to detach the public in Tigray regional state because they are closely attached to TPLF, and we don't really criticize the government for not doing that because the government tried a lot. Even priorly, the government coined and launched Reconciliation Commission, as I have said earlier on, which was headed by Cardinal Brahana Jesus and that of Deputy Commissioner Yetna Neguse, right? It was very tough time actually to have a public dialogue with Tigrayans. What is your comment on that?
You see, the problem is first we need to answer the whole process, the whole endeavors of that commission. It's not about separating a political party from the public. When we talk about reconciliation, when we talk about dialogue, it has different dimensions, and it has involves a number of agenda. So it's all setting the agenda. So I think the work or the job of the previous commission should be assessed and should be evaluated and reported. What went wrong? What was the problem? To deal with Tigrayans and to deal with TPLF, and how did they fail? Because we don't need to repeat the same problem, the same approach. So that should inform this commission. And when we talk about peace and reconciliation in the context of the public dialogue, I think the issue may be serious. The issue of Tigray and the conflict in Tigray could be one, but most significant as compared to the others. But I think we have a lot of disagreements here at the center of the city, everywhere. We don't know each other very well. In a sense that, you see, there are different narratives about this country. And those narratives should be clearly channeled. And we need to understand, we need to know the perspective or the narrative of the other, to sympathize, and at the same time to deal with in the course of the dialogue. So the problem that we raise about Tigray and TPLF is one, and it is a manifestation of the whole thing. So that's actually something visible on the ground. But we have lots of issues to solve because we are always, and we have been in a vicious circle of conflicts, and that pops up when the issues underlining or the issues in the deep structure of the society should be clearly addressed and brought to the table for discussion. And because, like I said to you before, sometimes I feel that we don't know each other very well. Because as a multilingual and multicultural country, most people do not know the language of the other. And language hides more than it tells. And there are a number of issues that could be raised to the diverse community so that people themselves, people to people, can discuss. Sometimes it's quite important to go beyond the elite. Because the elite is all often, part of the problem, at the same time part of the solution, we know. But sometimes quite, important to engage the public. So I appreciate if the government takes this, initiative in a sense that it involves the public, and if the dialogue is among or between the public.
Okay. Let's talk about the way out of reconciliation. What are the strategies of building peace through reconciliation?
Well, there is no one
orthodox.
Yes, there is no one shot that you can think about this, because
just
every conflict,
major strategies.
Yeah. You see, there is no one way out, because every conflict is unique by itself.
Exactly.
Every conflict is unique and very dynamic. But it is important to be clear about some questions before the deal. The first thing is we need to be clear about the depth and the width, the magnitude of the crisis, because we are dealing with crisis situation.
And the type of the conflict as
Exactly.
well. This one is a political conflict, isn't it? It's not a kind of like, it's a kind of ethnicity, or it's a kind of culture-based or differences on that arena. It's a political disagreement. So that you can tell me based upon the
Look,
universal principles
yes,
of
there are
reconciliation during political war.
Yeah. You see, in the first place, it's important to identify the cause. So, like I said to you before, treating the symptom is not enough unless you deal with the disease. So most of the time, we don't easily get the cause. So the first thing is identifying the cause. That's very much important, and to be clear about, because some of the activities, some of the conflicts are simply manifestations. So we need to go deep into identifying the causes. The second is we need to be clear about the victim, because the victim is often at the center of the reconciliation process. And we need to involve the victim in the process of reconciliation. And the victim has to be validator of the whole process at the end. So mostly, most of the reconciliation processes fail because of the principle of forgetting and forgiving. You can't forget everything. You can't forgive everything. So involving the victim is very much important, and validating the whole process. So involving the victim is at the center, like I said before. And the other interesting is about apologia. It's all about mercy, it's all about apology. But in the process, who is to apologize? And to what extent? And how do you apologize? You see, most of the time, mass apology is exercised. And a very good example is our government during the reform, the early stage of the reform, apologized to all those involved, but there is no responsibility and accountability. If there is no responsibility and accountability on the part of the group apologized, it's not working. It doesn't work.
Nonsense.
It's nonsense. So it must be clear about who did what. And that there must be confession. And the group or the person has to confess and demand apology. And can't be apologized. So I think the experience of Colombia would help us to better explain this. I will come to that. I'll come to that later.
Yeah.
But the other interesting thing is about the shy away. It's about don't tell and don't ask.
Yeah.
That's the problem we have in most of the reconciliation processes. I think about in the U.S. Army, there is what they call don't ask, don't tell. That's about when they're addressing gay issues. So when you come to the reconciliation process in Ethiopia, that appears in a different way. Let me tell you this. If there is a conflict between a husband and a wife, and the Shemagiles would sit and ask what was the cause. But most of the time, some topics are not disclosed.
They're not open for that discussion.
So it's all about don't tell, don't ask. That approach is not appropriate in the reconciliation process.
Exactly.
When we come to the public dialogue, to the dialogue in the making, I think it's quite important to avoid don't ask, don't tell, because that's a very significant one in identifying the clear cause. The other central point in these strategies is about dealing with silence. How do you deal with silence? You know, in some culture, silence is like, respect. In some others, it could mean you have not worked hard to uncover what is hidden in the heart and mind of the people, or they are dissatisfied. So you need to be clear about why some people, some group keep quiet.
You've raised a certain phrase before a while, forget and forgive, right? It's a wonderful quotation, sense of forgiveness, I know it.
Yeah, that's nice.
Does that work out? Like, how dare you
yes.
forget your traumas and your economic destruction and your all losses, your existential traits that happen to your children, your wife, the rapes, resource vandalizing. How do you accommodate this?
Look there. That's the problem in most of the reconciliation processes. People, those reconciling and facilitating, they focus on forgetting and forgiving at the expense of what? Peace. At the expense of what? Justice. So that does not work in most of the cases. So it is important to involve the victim and compensate the victim so that the victim can validate the whole process. So simply if you tell someone to forget, it doesn't work. By telling them to forget.
What are the items granted for those victims as a compensation zone?
Okay, compensations of different types, and could be monitoring, it could be non-monitoring, it could be cultural, it could be political. It depends upon the cause.
Who ought to be the moderator?
Dialogue demanded among the public in understanding on coming up with just common ground about this country. I think the purpose of this public dialogue or national dialogue, like I read it, it's about preparing a common ground about this country. For the last 40 years, we have capitalized on the differences that we have. We have even abused
wrong narratives.
abused, and we didn't work on a common ground. What if you ask somebody what's Ethiopia and what is the content of that country and what is the salience of that country? Sometimes you find it difficult to. So it's all about trying to build a common ground, not necessarily dealing with TPLF and the reconciling. But if we talk about that, even the whole process is who is to, like you asked me, who is to facilitate. Usually, people trusted, accepted by both groups. And sometimes, if you take, for example, Sierra Leone, they used, the international community as mediator. Sometimes people may try to, look out of the territory of the country, but that has its own problems. It has its own issues to talk. So it's all about individuals or groups that those opponents can trust and can be, neutral to both of them.
What has to be given priority during national dialogue? Of course, you try to mention it, but make it specific.
Yes, the agenda setting is one of the most important issues in national dialogue. In the first place, the public should be part and parcel of this. The agenda should be open, and the public has to, set the agenda, and then the Commission can prioritize. But most of the problem that we have is we set the agenda, the elite set agenda, and simply communicate that to the public. That's a serious problem. So if the most important thing is to involve the public in every situation, and at the same time communicate findings, communicate everything timely. A very good example is the confusion that we have about the commission today. The public has a confusion because it's not well communicated. The government has to clearly communicate the intentions, the process, and the activities that commission ahead of others, like in the social media or in other outlets, misinform and disinform the public.
Okay, another question. Ethiopian government has released some political prisoners recently, and what is the role of releasing political prisoners in widening the political space and its contribution for the national dialogue as well?
I think this is not a new experience for Ethiopia. Since the reform, I think every prisoner, everyone was released from everywhere. That's how we are known for, I think, during the reform. So this doesn't surprise me. This doesn't surprise me.
What is, its contribution to the national dialogue?
I'm coming to that. It doesn't surprise me, releasing. I think the Abiy government is known for this very well. Even, bringing prisoners from other countries too. We are known for that.
Those who were in exile as well.
Exactly. So that's very important because everybody is important in national dialogue, despite even the figure, despite the population. Diversity of opinion is at the center of public dialogue. So releasing political prisoners recently is a good endeavor because every politician, prisoner, if you call them political prisoners, they have people behind them. So if you are dealing with them, then you should address all members of the public. So releasing the prisoners of whatever kind is vital in engaging public to public discourse or dialogue, and they are also important. The dialogue is to bring people to the common point. We have politicians, we have people, from, far distance in terms of their ideologies. So the dialogue is very important to bring them into the middle. So as the attempt is to make or, to craft a common ground, I think these people are very much important.
Okay. Yeah. The Ethiopian National Dialogue is an ambitious attempt in bringing a long-lasting peace in Ethiopia, right? And we have this Tunisian National Dialogue and Colombian National Dialogue and Peace and Reconciliation regard. These two countries are good examples when it comes to peace and reconciliation. What ought to Ethiopia learn from these two nations in dealing with this national dialogue, though?
Yeah, I'm interested with the
Colombian one.
Colombian example. I think that must be communicated to or taken as a good example for most of the conflict countries in the world in dealing with and resolving conflicts. I think the Colombian war that's the longest, I guess, about 52 years.
Yeah.
And there was a division among or between ruler and urban, and the government siding the rural and the rebel siding with
the towns and cities.
Yeah, or the other way, I'm not quite sure. So what we learn from them is something different from Northern Ireland, for example, Sierra Leone, or any other countries. They have their own unique approach. I mean, the Colombians, they went through a unique approach. So you know, they didn't go against with the international community, and they didn't invite the international community at the same time. So they didn't have, you know, that much relationship with the West, and tried to involve in the international community in dealing with their problems. They engaged themselves. So the rebel group and the government signed agreement. So, and the lesson is, so they didn't, you know, they didn't focus on the peace. They focused on, you know, the justice also. You see, most of the conflict resolution or reconciliation processes, they focus only on the peace, and they forget the justice to the victim and participating the victim. You can take the South African case. You can take, you know, most of the cases in Africa. So, at the expense of, you know, the justice, they capitalize on the, you know, peace process. So that becomes very fragile. And you can take, you know, the South Sudan case as well. So what is interesting is there is mandatory confession in the Colombian case. Both the government and the rebel. The whole process is one central lesson is mandatory confession. So the rape, the mass killings, the genocides that you've been involved, for example, you should confess. And if you confess, you may be imprisoned only from 5 to 8 years, and the prison actually in the community service. But if you don't confess, you'll be imprisoned for 20 years, minimum of 20 years. So there is what? A kind of balancing the justice and giving, you know, credit to the victim and taking responsibility. So you see, there are three things in the whole process. People may deny responsibility or shift responsibility or could accept fully the responsibility of, you know, whatever they committed.
Okay.
So the Colombian case teaches us that those from both the government and the rebel group, they take the responsibility with full responsibility. And the other interesting is the main cause of the problem is the rural-urban division. And the rural part was not, you know, given well focus in terms of infrastructure. So the government was, you know, kind of given responsibility to invest on agriculture and infrastructure. Every of the issues they raised about community service and the whole process, actually they have taken their own, you know, their own culture into consideration, the Caribbean culture. Then taking that as, you know, a frame, within that frame, and everybody taking the responsibility, and the apology was very specific. And then in the whole process, the victims were involved, the victims were compensated, and the victims were the validators of the whole process. That's what we learned from Colombia.
Actually, we do have our own conflict resolution methodologies in different ethnicity. For instance, in Oromo culture, we do have a Bagadas and Hadassing case. And in the southern nations, they do have their own in Amhara. And what ought to be the role of elderlies in this national dialogue?
Well, you know, the problem with Ethiopia is for the last 40 years, Ethiopia forgot its own, you know, leaders, indigenous leaders. Because for the last 50 years, Ethiopia didn't image itself. You know, the approach was outside looking. But you need to develop inward looking perspective. So the Abagadas were forgotten, the elders were forgotten for years. Anyway, Ethiopia should look back to its own indigenous way of dealing with conflicts.
Mm.
And when you come to the different approach from the lessons that you take from different groups, a very good, recent example is the Gedio or Shemagiles.
Yeah, the Gedio elderlies.
Elders, yeah. So they were significant.
They kneel down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then they fixed the problem.
exactly.
So I think we need to go back to ourselves and look at how we can involve, make use of the Shemagiles or the elders in the whole process. And the Shemagiles are, I think, very popular in a communal country like Ethiopia in dealing with conflicts and peace processes.
Okay, appreciate it. And one last question. What has to be the role of media in this national dialogue? Because I do have my own doubt. Some media infringe and ignite
Exactly.
conflict than mitigating the conflict itself. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, sure.
They fuel fire upon the ongoing conflict.
Yeah.
Others tend to their own agenda and goal, interest, ego. You see, what ought to be the role of media, those medias which are affiliated to the government and other private media as well, because it's
Yeah.
very vital.
I think I've been giving different trainings and workshops on how to report conflicts, and at the same time the role of media in reconciliation. Maybe I have already told you about the first commission. I gave them training on this. So the media is very much important, and the first thing is we need to clearly identify the media that we have. We have four perspectives of the media, four polarized media in this country, based on the political arrangement. So now when we are dealing with the dialogue about commission, so we are trying to deal. So the media should also involve itself in the process, and they should report the actual scenario, the actual situation, instead of interpreting that in their own way. Because every time you interpret a point, it's all about the ideology that you have. So we have four different ideologies in this country. So those ideologies are running the media. So the owners of the media, they all have their own ideology. So, and we know that there are about four ideologies. So these should not be, portrayed, and this should not be facilitated, or this should not guide misunderstanding and misrepresentation and misinforming. So the point is, everything should be reported straight from the scenario, and information we get must be communicated to the public, must be through the communication office of this public or dialogue or the national dialogue office. I think that's already in making. So it's all about distancing yourself from interpretations. So a good journalist should distance himself or herself from her own interpretation or his own interpretation of the actual conflict situation and dialogue.
Okay, Dr. Anthony Tsagay, intercultural communication expert from Addis Ababa University School of Journalism. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Dear viewers, this brings you the end of our edition for today. Bye-bye. See you next time with another edition. Take care.